Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us from all over the world for our event, Iranian Cinema, 123 Years of History. My name is Negar Siari. I'm a PhD candidate in linguistics and a teaching assistant in the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University. If at any time during this webinar you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A box so that we may address that question during our designated Q&A portion. As always, questions are welcome in Farsi, English, and Finglish. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program, Dr. Farima Mustafi.
Salam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. On behalf of Georgetown University's Persian Studies program, it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to each of you. Today marks a significant moment as we embark on our 18th Jolly News lecture series, presented in the format of a webinar. We are delighted to have you join us for Iranian Cinema, 123rd years of history. We extend our sincere gratitude for your presence and your ongoing interest in our cultural events. Stay tuned for information on additional events next semester. Our heartfelt appreciation goes to Shahrzad and Farhad Jalinous, whose generous support has made this cultural gathering possible. I turn it back to Negar for a brief introduction of our dear panelists, Dr. Golbarg Rekabtalai, Dr. Pedram Partovi, and Mr. Ehsan Khoshbakht.
I would like to invite our panelists to come on camera and be with our audience. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce our panelists for today, Dr. Golbarg Rekabtalai. By the way, can you hear me well, everyone? Okay, awesome. Please welcome Dr. Golbarg Rekabtalai, an esteemed historian and author, specializing in modern Iranian and Middle Eastern history. An associate professor at Seton Hall University, her work dissects the intersection of cinema and modernity, particularly through the lens of cosmopolitanism and cultural exchanges in 20th century Iran. She is the author of Iranian Cosmopolitanism, a Cinematic History, and the co-director of the Middle Eastern and North African Studies program. Ehsan Khoshbakht joins us as a distinguished Iranian documentary filmmaker, film curator, and writer. As co-director of the Film Festival 2 Cinemato Ritrovato, he has significantly contributed to the study of film history and restoration. His work also includes curating the most comprehensive survey of Iranian pre-revolutionary cinema in the Museum of Modern Art, casting new light on classics from 1925 to 1979 and the works of filmmakers such as Ebrahim Golestan and Forough Farrokhzad. His documentary, Film Farsi, has been showcased internationally, and his recent book features interviews with director Asghar Farhadi. We're also honored to have Dr. Pedram Partovi with us, a historian with a deep dive into the medieval and modern Muslim world. An associate professor at American University with a focus on media's role in shaping Iran's civil religion. His innovative research offers fresh perspectives on Iranian history. His extensive publications explore the dynamics of nationalism and Islam. Dr. Partovi earned his PhD from the University of Chicago. We're all eager to hear your perspectives on Iranian cinema's evolution and impact. Please lead us into this discussion and take the floor.
Thank you so much, Negar, for such a generous introduction. I would also like to thank Georgetown University Persian Studies program and the Jolly News lecture series, especially Dr. Farima Mostofi, of course, Negar, Siari, and Shiva Tabatabai for extending the invitation to us and also facilitating this conversation, which I think I speak on behalf of all the panelists to say we're very excited about. I think since we're going to have a conversation on the history of cinema in the last 123 years, if I may have permission of my co-panelists, I think I am going to start maybe posing some questions, and then we can continue the conversation after that. Please feel free to ask follow-up questions in between if you choose to. So I noticed that the title of this event is 123 years of Iranian cinema, which is interesting in that it has so much to say about the history of cinema in Iran, or as some might say, Iranian cinema. So it raises the question of periodization of cinema in Iran and perhaps also globally. So the first question I would like to ask both of you is, where does the history of Iranian cinema begin for you? Is there one periodization of Iranian cinema? Why is it that we start 123 years ago? Should we start later? I would like to just maybe open the conversation with this question and then take it from there.
I can start, Pedram, if you don't mind. Sure. The fact is that up to the late 90s, Iranians didn't know that they potentially had 123 years of film history. It came with the discovery of a vault in the Golestan Palace of films belonging to the Qajar period. And they were sent to, in a very fragile condition, they were sent to France, to CNC, the biggest center of cinema in France, run by the government, and they were restored. A copy was kept in France, and it was returned to Iran. So this is something we discovered as late as the late 90s, and we were not aware of it. Fine. But even today, as we are talking, it's almost impossible to screen these films. They exist in fragments, but if you want to see the entire range of these films that were restored, if you go to the suburbs of Paris, Sensei, they would play you a VHS tapes of these films, not the original material. They will play VHS tapes. And if you want to show these films anywhere else, you need the permission of Iranians, of the Golestan Palace Foundation in charge of that collection, which is so far has been nearly impossible. So I think this should tell us a great deal about Iranian cinema. First of all, it's a cinema whose history is still being written, being discovered and rediscovered. It's an unwritten history. It's incomplete. We just deal with it in fragments. We use different sources for grasping an understanding of Iranian cinema. We rely on secondary sources because in many cases, we don't have the most basic access, which is essential for writing the history of a national cinema, and that's viewing the films. I'm going to say one more thing and hand it over to Pedro. There is a lovely picture, a collage designed for this event. I'm guessing it's Negar's or Shiva's or Farima's work, or they have done this in collaboration. But it poses some really important questions. If you go back to your mailbox and look at the image they have chosen for Iranian cinema, 123 years of history, you will see 4 pictures combined. Look at them. On the left-hand side of that, you have The Lower Girl, which is a film, the first Iranian talkie made in India. It tells us about the transnational aspect of Iranian cinema. This is a film which kind of exists. It exists in complete form, but if you look at the film, you realize that there is musical recording on the film that doesn't correspond with the time of the production of the film. So probably the copy that we have access to was put together in the 50s because it has music from Gone with the Wind on the soundtrack. And the soundtrack of Gone with the Wind was not released until the 50s on LP. Okay, so sort of okay, we might have the logo. Then the second picture is The Ballad of Tara. It's a film which was indefinitely banned in Iran and never screened. Okay, so we are dealing with the history of censorship too. This film was restored and presented in the festival that I co-direct in Bologna, Il Cinema Ritrovato, last June. So for the first time, people could look at the film in pristine condition since the time of production in 1978. The third picture is from Abi and Rabi, a kind of silent comedy inspired by Danish comedy duo, which is completely lost. We have nothing of that film except the ghostly picture you're looking at. And then finally, on the right-hand side, there is Report by Kiarostami, which exists only in a terrible copy, and that copy is missing a key scene of the film. And this is a film which was destroyed during the Iranian Revolution. So as you see, we are dealing with ghosts, fragments, and things that we have to construct based on imagination, literature, and secondary sources to arrive at some sort of notion of the history of Iranian cinema. Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I would completely agree with Ehsan that we're still very much figuring out this early history of Iranian cinema. Very little of it remains. Very little of what it remains, it has not been accessible to scholars or anyone else for that matter. And so, yes, I mean, it is difficult to piece together and requires all kinds of ancillary sources to do so, what we know of it. I think it's also very interesting that so much of this early history is part of courtly history. I mean, it belongs, cinema, at least initially in Iran, belongs to the aristocracy. It belongs to the royal court and the aristocracy. It's only later on that it becomes a popular pastime. I mean, right into the 1930s, we can talk about just a couple of dozen movie theaters in the entire country. I think there were only 8 in Tehran, the capital, in 1932, when The Lower Girl was being released to Iranian audiences. So it's a cinema that's sort of only slowly progressing in those early decades towards becoming a pastime of the masses in particular. And so I think many historians who have tried to look at Iranian cinema as a subject have had not only difficulty putting together this early period, but are conflicted about, well, when does it actually become a national cinema, in the sense that it is something that's at least owned or enjoyed by a significant proportion of the population. And yes, I mean, at some level we might venture to say that it doesn't really happen. This doesn't really happen until after World War II. The Iranian cinema is as we know, as a product produced in Iran almost exclusively for an Iranian audience, does not really come together until after World War II. And so it's much younger, perhaps, than some of the other cinemas in the region, especially the Indian cinema or the Egyptian cinema for that matter.
Really thought-provoking insights on this history. And I maybe want to actually also talk about some of the points that you mentioned, because Ehsan talked about this history of cinema, the importance of archives, of course, and this history as being alive and changing, not being static. I mean, it's changing every year in a way. I mean, who knows what kind of film we're going to find, or what documents we will find in a few years, perhaps in another part of the world, that have somehow been able to, you know, maybe get a copy of one of these films, or, you know, maybe it was stolen from someone. And on the other hand, Pedram, you talk about the importance of cinema as a court leisure, as a courtly practice in a way, and not necessarily one that's public, at least not in a few decades. So in a way, I guess I would like to also pose a different perspective. I mean, now a lot of historians of cinema, Iranian cinema, actually, instead of speaking about Iranian cinema, they speak about cinema in Iran, which again accounts for all cinematic experiences or all filmic experiences or experience and experimentation with film. Because at the same time, yes, I mean, cinema is not necessarily public in the 1900s, 1910s even. However, it wasn't necessarily public anywhere. I mean, it takes a while for cinema theaters to mushroom throughout the cities. Nevertheless, film screening venues were in a sense public. I mean, let's take Sahaf Bashi's cinema, for example, some of the other film screening venues, such as Farus. A lot of people actually had a cinematograph in their shops. So, you know, people would buy antiques, and then they would also perhaps get to know and watch these new films or see this new technology that existed. So in that sense, because by virtue of being in shops, in stores, in you know, in public places, maybe we can argue that this was a public phenomenon, but of course people don't have access to it because it's not necessarily for mass consumption yet. Mass consumption, as you actually, of course, rightfully mentioned, is something that comes maybe after World War II with mass consumerism and mushrooming of course, technologies, and, you know, also an increase in people's spending money in a way. So I really like the way that you framed it. I think what you just mentioned is how cinema scholars, how historians, how people in the field actually discuss history of cinema from different perspectives, and how when it's looked at from different perspectives, the history also changes. As you rightfully mentioned, should we start cinema with the first Iranian film productions? And when we say Iranian, should we start with film productions by native Iranians? Should we start with film productions by perhaps Iranian citizens, or those living in Iran, whom a lot of times were in fact, you know, these what I call cosmopolitans? So I would like us maybe to continue the conversation a little bit in that direction. And Pedram, please, if you have any questions to kind of lead us through that, feel free to ask us those questions.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I suppose one question that I sort of have here is, in what direction does film production go after the first Iranian film experiences? I mean, how do we get the formation of a cinema industry in Iran? I mean, obviously there is some experimentation that's taking place by some of these cosmopolitans, as Goldberg mentions, largely outside of the country. There are abortive attempts also to by Iranians to connect up or link up with the Egyptian cinema. This is some new research that's been done that reveals these particular links. But we don't really get something approaching a cinema industry until later in Iran. And I'm wondering here what direction in which this cinema industry heads.
If you don't mind, Ehsan, I'm gonna go first, maybe, and then you can add, especially on film productions after World War II. I kind of want to take it from what we started talking about. I mean, this film experience or cinema experience. There we do have film fragments, as Ehsan mentioned, from the first 2 decades of the 20th century. We don't necessarily, these films have not been categorized, they've not been cataloged. We don't necessarily know exactly who took these films and for what purposes they actually filmed them. But if as I guess cinema historians or film historians, we can kind of get a more comprehensive view of film production by also looking at other cultural milieus. We can, for example, look at newspapers. We can look at essays and what people are saying about cinema in, let's say, for example, 1910s. And in those, like in my own research, I see that a lot of people, they have these advertisements for films, film screenings, again, in the back of their shops. Now, by this time, a lot of them do have cinemas being, operating in different parts of Tehran, sometimes at the center, which later on turns into the south of the city, but also on the borders of the cities, around gates of Tehran. In fact, there were a few film theaters. And and we know that people did have cinematograph devices, which not only showed films, but also they recorded films as well. So it could be that some of these films that we have remaining from that time period, many of which were found actually at Golestan, were perhaps commissioned by the government, but some of them could also be, films that the cinematographers decided, they wanted to film because it's an interesting. For example, there's a really short one of people passing a bridge. In kind of like a wilderness. I mean, it's not very clear what it is, but there's mountains in the back, and there are people with their horses and carriages kind of passing over that bridge. So it really does beg the question, I mean, why people were recording these events. There is, for example, a film of Shah Abdulazim train of a train or what do they call those tramways? In fact, leaving or arriving at Shah Abdulazim shrine, or going towards Shah Abdulazim shrine. A lot of these, to me, kind of say that people at the time want to kind of make Iran a contemporary of the world. They want to actually say Iranians can also have an industry or advancements that can be on a par with especially European countries. This, to me, at least shows desires. It shows a futural thinking about what people want in the future, and the same people who are making these films, the same people who are actually having cinematograph devices in their shops, they also create this cosmopolitan culture in cities such as Tehran, which, in my opinion, the first films made by Iranians, and actually, I should say, films made in Persian language, they're actually made by these same people within this cosmopolitan culture that is created in the first 2-3 decades of the 20th century. And so with that, of course, beginning in 1928, we have films being made by Ibrahim Moradi, for example, in Rasht. Later on, we have films made by Armenian Iranians. We have also later on in the 1930s, of course, we have films made by Iranians in India, using a lot of course, both Indians, but also Iranian diaspora in India, which again kind of speaks to this cosmopolitan culture that existed in, I should say, in the region in the first few decades of the 20th century. But that direction, of course, changes a little bit after World War II begins. And I'm going to stop here because I don't want to take up all the time. So if any of you actually want to continue that conversation, please go ahead.
If you don't mind, I just wanted to point out a few, I think, key concepts when it comes to that period. I think probably are important. For instance, for me, basically, the whole thing, the whole idea of early Iranian cinema is about freedom, or rather the lack of freedom. What do I mean by it? Take the early films of Qajar period, shot mostly by Ibrahim Khan Saafbashi. When he, in the transition from Qajar period to Pahlavi dynasty, he fell out of favor, and he was kind of barred from pursuing his activities, and he was sent on exile to a different part of Iran, to Mashhad, which is actually where I come from. Now, a key part of Iranian film history was kind of erased shortly after his death because he fell out of favor. And what is interesting that recently, for the very first time in his program that was shown in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, we managed to show films made by his son, Abu Qasim Rezai, who made one of the most popular documentaries, if not the most popular documentary in the history of Iranian cinema, about that pilgrimage to Hajj. He was the son of Saafbashi, and he didn't have much memory of his father, but then you see a kind of continuation of a tradition. When we deal with images that are shot in Iran, but by Western or non-Iranian cinematographers, we always deal with the problem of freedom. The moment they arrive at the Iranian borders, whether from Turkey or Arabia, later Iraq, they deal with the problem of the lack of permission. They are not allowed to shoot in Iran. So we have many travelers starting from Europe. They shoot a lot when they are in Turkey or in Arab countries. The moment they are in Iran, the amount of images is almost minimal. So you have, for instance, Ella Meyer, a famous Swiss traveler. If you look at her footage, she shot the first color footage of the Imam Reza shrine in Mashhad in secret. But she mentioned that we couldn't film in Iran. I was recently asked to reconstruct the footage of a documentary from 1924 called Lure of the East, and I did it. But the amount of footage shot in Iran, which was still considerable compared to Turkey, India, and Afghanistan, was very little. So it's the idea of freedom. Why, I always ask myself this question, why Iranians moved to India to do modern things, new things? Why Sadegh Hidayat published The Blind Owl in India and not in Iran? Why Sepantal moved to India? It's the question of freedom. It's partly, you might say, in the case of making a sound film, it was also a technical question. Iran didn't have the facilities, but it was also the idea of freedom, that in this case, freedom of movement tied to the freedom of telling the story the way they wanted to tell. And then they were connecting with people in these neighboring countries in the region, like the Parsi people, Avish Irani, the co-director of the film. So it's always part of these limitations as a country fraught with tension, and these limitations which force people to pursue the idea of creating moving images in other parts of the world. And finally, for again back to the retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, it actually started with 1955. We can start it in early 30s if we consider the Indian films, if we could access us for the second part of the program. But the beginning of film production is right after the war, and done with very little resources, plenty of imagination, and a keen eye on what's happening in the region and in the world. In other words, what Gulbak mentioned, the history of film culture in Iran, which is completely different from the history of film production in Iran, had a longer history because the film culture was already there. Visual storytelling was something they could create, they could tell stories while moving images and sound. And this is how, from the early 50s, we have what today call, Iranian cinema, the way we could see it, access it, and screen it to the audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It's the origins of a film industry in Iran also very much speak to its cosmopolitanism as well, the cosmopolitanism of film culture in Iran, because before we get films being made in Iran, we have films being dubbed into Persian, foreign films being dubbed into Persian, and often remade through that dubbing process, given some kind of Iranian cultural sensibilities often. So the earliest studios that are established in Iran began as dubbing studios before they became film production studios. And so, yes, I mean, there is, we can talk about the period, especially after World War II, as a kind of paradise for film going. Iran is a paradise for film going. You could watch films from virtually every part of the world in a way that was impossible in this country, that was dominated by Hollywood cinema, and virtually nothing else made it to the silver screen, except for a few small theaters in New York or the other cultural capitals of the United States. But in Iran, it was a very different story. In Iran, you could watch Soviet films, you could watch Indian films, you could watch Egyptian films, you could watch French films and American films all at the same time. And it's perhaps unsurprising that we get the creation of a film industry that out of this sort of cosmopolitan cultural matrix after World War II. I mean, we might even talk about film dubbing as a kind of experiment in filmmaking before we get film production altogether.
But even Pedro, even the whole idea of the idea of film dubbing is also something which is kind of, in a very fascinating way, tied to the question of freedom and movement, because the person who dubbed the first film into Persian, he had Nazi tendencies. He was working for Win Film in Vienna, and after the end of the Second World War, he packed his stuff and wanted to go back to Iran. He was afraid to enter the Iranian territory because someone told him he might get arrested. Allied forces are still in Iran. So he was stranded in Istanbul and got together with a company called Ses Film. Some good historiography has been done on that company. And he took a Spanish film called La Gitania, and that became like his hobby or his way of killing time and perhaps earning some money by doing this. So again, he didn't want to be there. Perhaps he didn't want to do it if he was not there backing or doing something else. That was forced by the fears of a group of people, especially before the Second World War, during the Second World War, and right short before the 50s had. And to a large extent, that dictates both the vitality of Iranian cinema, but also why all these different elements, all these different influences are. I'm not going to get into any more detail, but you can add to that the movement of Arab Jews, communists from neighboring countries to Iran, and contributing to the history of Iranian cinema, which is another fascinating chapter in the early 50s.
If I can add, I mean, I really like your responses, and I think one thing that we should take into account here is historical context, the historical context within which these films or experiences with films are being made. Ehsan, you mentioned, I think you didn't call it an industry. Oh, you said film production, and how it is different from film culture. And I think we should keep in mind that we're talking about early 20th century. We're talking about experimentation still, which is, I think, part and parcel of this experience with film and later on film production. So without that experimentation, without those film fragments, without making those scenes, that reality, that whatever you want to call it, recording that in film, you cannot have film production later on. So I just want to again just maybe emphasize this idea that not looking and not including these film fragments, these experiences and experimentation with film and recording, even photography in the early 20th century is leads to this forgetfulness, and it basically does a disservice to those who actually kind of paved the ground for filmmakers, those who really build an industry later on. So I, in my opinion, they actually should be included. I mean, when we're talking about Iranian cinema or cinema in Iran, we need to take those experiences into account. And we shouldn't necessarily start history of cinema after 1955. But that's my understanding again, but taking into account the historical context, which I mean, you're absolutely right, Ehsan, to say that this idea of freedom and having that freedom to do what they wanted to do was, of course, has been really important in filmmaking in Iran and in many other countries where there has been censorship or there has been some kind of oppressive regime. However, one other thing we also need to take into account is filmmakers such as Abdul Hossein Sepanta in India. The reason that he was in India wasn't necessarily to flee from the government in Iran, or he was studying Zoroastrianism, and he was studying that in India. Now I don't know what the situation for studies of Zoroastrianism was in Iran, but I'm assuming that it was kind of non-existent. So it was because of also this curiosity, I guess, he had that that kind of led him to travel, to reside somewhere else. But it also shows us that the kind of boundaries that we make today in terms of Iranian cinema, Indian cinema, didn't necessarily exist so starkly in the past, in such a stark manner in the past. Those are just a few things I wanted to mention. But maybe we can just take it a little bit further to this period that you were talking about. Go ahead.
Just to touch on what you were saying before about how we need to take into consideration not just all of these influences from outside, I suppose, or the attempts made to create a fledgling industry that begin elsewhere and then relocate to Iran. And I think Ehsan is right. I mean, with dubbing, it begins in Turkey. Italy is another very important early center for dubbing of films into Persian before this industry is transferred back to Iran. And I would also agree with you that some of these, bits and pieces, these films that we largely know only in bits and pieces today from before World War II, they do certainly have an impact on the filmmakers that we know better from after World War II. And so, I mean, some would argue that Dokhtar Lor or the Lor Girl provides a kind of template for many filmmakers after 1955, if we go by the date that Ehsan gives us here for the creation of a kind of commercial film industry in Iran. And so, yes, I mean, that earlier period, it's film watching that informs filmmaking later on, a generation later on.
Right. So maybe we can move on to Film Farsi since we're already getting there. 1955. Give me your thoughts on Film Farsi.
Well, I have to correct myself. I said 55 was the beginning of the production in the program that I did for MoMA. But in reality, I can show films as early as 51. And I hope next time we could show films from 51. And there were films from 25 shot in Iran or shot in neighboring countries in subjects related to Iran. But in 1953, a man that I befriended much later in life, Hushan Kawusi, a wonderful, very knowledgeable man, also a kind of a difficult character, which back then, a kind of culture or snobbery of Western educated people in the country, uh, it was a fad, and he definitely was part of that fad. He coined the term film farsi to refer to Iranian popular films, which were started to emerge after the Second World War, and after some unsuccessful attempts, surprisingly became very successful because they were done on a very modest budget. They were distributed on a kind of very modest scale. So it was a kind of a sell-safe bet for them. And these films, when we talk about film farsi, we are talking about many different types of cinema. We're talking about the cinema of the lowest quality possible to the cinema of the highest quality possible in terms of imagination, camera work, editing, music. You find absolute brilliance and absolute garbage within the range of film farsi. And because of that, you get a notion of Iran, Iranianness, and the culture of that country in an almost documentary style. Because as escapist as these films were, most of them were actually shot on the streets, and people were wearing the dress that they used to wear before the camera started operating. So you get a glimpse into Iranian life between the early 50s and the time of the revolution. And some people would argue that these films continued even after the revolution in a different way, through what has been labeled as film farsi. Now, what I have tried to do with my documentary and other projects and screening examples of Iranian popular cinema is to reclaim that word, get rid of the dismissive and negative connotations of the word, and just using it to discuss the vibrancy, excitement, and the range of Iranian popular cinema and Iranian genre films. And for the first time in the programs I have done in the past 3-4 years, we have introduced these films to the international audience, and the reaction has been really, really wonderful in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, it's not certainly Hushan Kawusi is the person that popularizes the term film farsi, but another film scholar, Muhammad Taoumi Najad, has argued that film farsi as a term was first used in advertisements, for dubbed films, for films dubbed into Persian. And so again, here's this connection to film dubbing that we've been talking about. That it was used at least initially to highlight or bring the audience's attention to the fact that they could watch a film in the Persian language. And then Dr. Kawusi sort of takes up this term as you rightly point out, as a kind of term of abuse for the films that are made in Iran exclusively for Iranians, as being of lacking any kind of cultural authenticity, that the only thing about them that is Iranian is their language. And I would agree with Hassan that this is a woeful mischaracterization of many of these films. And I also take issue with the categorization of them as escapism, as some kind of escape from the drudgery of everyday life in Iran. Well, as Hassan points out, they are about everyday life in Iran in many ways. So the notion of them as escapist is itself kind of strange, I would say. And again, I mean, one of the astute students of this Iranian cinema and culture class that's being taught at Georgetown asked the question of why is it that so many of these films end tragically? Well, I mean, if it was all based in fantasy, one would expect happy endings. But I think the student is quite correct that many of them do not have happy endings, or at best have sort of bittersweet endings. And so the notion of these films as escapist on that front as well is kind of out of bounds, I would argue.
Absolutely. I agree with both of you. I mean, I think this notion of film Farsi or these films being categorized by their Farsi or Persian language kind of speaks to the time, to this period as well. This period of heightened nationalism, but also a period where heightened nationalism is also in a way kind of pushed against, in fact, by some of the trends that are happening in society, being informed, of course, by the rise of socialism and so on. Just one interesting fact: before film Farsi was coined by film Farsi as one word, of course, coined by Hushan Kawusi. A lot of the critics were using other terms to refer to these films or to make fun of them. Nawar mutaharrik, or a moving reel, was another term that was being used to kind of denote the fact that these are just like moving reels. There's no content or substance in them. And yes, I have seen it many times that actually people are calling this film Farsi, but as two words, or film Farsi, again, referring to the Persian language as the only thing that distinguishes these films. But I also totally agree with both of you that these films, again, being informed by the everyday of life of people, tells us so much, kind of like a primary source into the lives of people in this period, telling us about their desires, telling us about some of the debates, maybe social debates in this period, but also telling us about people's means or the tools they had to negotiate with the fast changing society that they were living in, sometimes accepting it, sometimes rejecting it, sometimes also having a difficult time kind of rejecting, for example, tradition, or letting go of tradition in order to become a modern citizen. So in that sense, I also find these films fascinating in what they show us from this period. Since we don't have that much time left, I would like us to maybe get to other trends that we see during this time, and then maybe we can wrap it up with some larger questions. Anyone wants to maybe talk about the trends that come after and how they're kind of connected to what we have discussed so far?
For me, they don't necessarily come after. In all these key moments in the history of Iranian cinema, there is a tinge of nationalism. So the return to the ancient Iran, India is the place. So there's this fantasy, Sadeh Khedayat, that fantasy, Sepanta, that fantasy, that maybe if we go to India, we could find more signs of what we perceive as the pre-Islam Iran. And so that plays a key role. And I was actually 2 weeks ago, I was in Mumbai searching for traces of Ardashir Irani because I would love to put together a retrospective on Ardashir Irani. And I have to tell you, the ratio of loss in Indian cinema and films produced by Ardashir Irani is as bad as Iranian cinema. That's a different story. So we have that idea. And that is why what we call today as cinema mutafawid or Iranian New Wave is actually a trend starting in documentary cinema again as early as the 50s of showing the heritage and the monuments of Iranian culture. So out of what I call heritage cinema, documentaries made by people who had studied in the West, Farokh Ghaffari, Feridun Rahnama, mostly about architectural monuments and artifacts and museums in Iran, something is born that is not very imaginative. It's rather tedious, but it is turning the camera on the dead objects rather than the vibrant life, as opposed to film Farsi. And through that, which perhaps you or Pedram would like to talk about, we have examples like Ibrahim Gulistan, who more or less started with the same mission, even though for a different type of company, and realized that the beauty of the cinema, or at least his art, was in subverting what was told and the way these films were done up to 1958 when he started producing his company. And from there on, 58, 61, 62, this is a very important period under study. We have the emergence of people like Gulistan, Ghaffari, and Farukh Farrokhzad, and what becomes later the new Iranian cinema, the modernist Iranian cinema, whatever label you want to put on it. And that's a cinema best known in the West if we talk about the pre-revolutionary period.
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of connects up with one of the questions that the students also asked before the panel gathered. Who is responsible for this cinema mutafavet, or this parallel cinema, this alternative modernist cinema that really begins to come together from the late 1960s, especially onwards. And certainly, I mean, one of the more interesting things about this cinema is that it's largely supported by the state. Nevertheless, most of these films are ultimately banned by the state as well. It's a very strange situation in which one hand of the government doesn't know what the other hand seems to be doing. And we can talk about parallels to this after the revolution as well, when the Islamic Republic becomes, in many ways, arms of the Islamic Republic's government becomes, in many ways, the major film producer in the country. And there are many, many films that are made, or attempts are made to bring them to a conclusion that are, they're either banned from screening, or they're banned during the production phase. And so this seems to be also a kind of long-term trend that speaks to Ehsan's sort of historical theme for Iranian cinema of a lack of freedom. That attempts have been made to sort of broaden and expand the repertoire of Iranian filmmaking, and the state has played a major role in all of this, but the state has also played a major role in constraining all of this as well.
Yeah, and to add to both Pedram and Ehsan's comments on this, I like this question that Pedram posed: who is responsible for the cinema? And I also want to maybe highlight the role of film critics, but also highlight again the historical context of this period, because from very early on, when we have Film Farsi, the critics are writing against this trend, because they're looking at, these are critics, Western educated, or people or critics that through the virtue of their careers, they have access to films that are being made outside Iran. And we're talking about, some cinematic trends, Italian neorealist films, French New Wave later on. They're watching these films and then watching Film Farsi, and they're thinking, why is it that Iran does not have a film industry that kind of is on a par, again, in terms of content, in terms of form, with these films outside that are being made by fellow filmmakers globally. So I kind of feel like the critics, film critics, cultural thinkers of this time were also in a way responsible for giving direction to directors, to filmmakers. They themselves, many of them, become filmmakers, right? Or are filmmakers, in fact. And also the audience. Let's not forget that audiences, Iranians, are becoming richer during this time. People are spending more time and more money on going to see films. So in a way, once you have that fully fledged film production, film industry, it becomes possible for directors, these young group of directors who are making films, alternative films during this time, to engage in global conversations on alternative films, on new wave films, on films that are social realist, that actually show parts of cities. Again, I should also mention that they're very much informed by global ideologies during these times. Hassan mentioned 1960s were formative years, especially mid-1960s were formative years for the solidification of the cinema, I should say, because you're right, it didn't come after. It was very much emerging at the same time that Film Farsi is being produced, of course. It just takes, in a way, Film Farsi and gives something else or produces something else. So yeah, the role of also audiences who are becoming more educated, they're becoming richer, and also film critics who are writing about this. That these two, I think, should also be taken into account when we're talking about alternative cinema.
Well, can I add something? Because here about the role of the critics, I respectfully disagree with you. I could give you examples of 4 films that have been responsible for being restored: Brecon Mirror, A Stranger in the Fog, Chess of the Wind, The House is Black. If you go through the contemporary reviews, they're just appalling. There's not a single review published during the original screening of Brecon Mirror that supports this film in any way. House is Black was trash, and only when Furuk was killed, all of a sudden she was turned into a martyr. It's Chess of the Wind. The reception of Chess of the Wind in Iran was just heartbreaking for the filmmaker. And when you go back, there's no trace of people understanding the most basic kind of stylistic innovations of the film, and completely misunderstanding even the plot of the film. So for me, that again goes back to the idea of society that is unsettled. It suffers from trauma, from there is ongoing tension. That tension is very exhausting. It doesn't contribute to the creativity anymore. And that is why the films that I mentioned went through, drifted into oblivion, or alternative versions, modified versions of them appeared because of the shocking, because of the violent reception of these films. So this is something that, at least in the cases that I have worked on, I have to disagree, and I have to say that it's been what we consider like the film criticism or film literature in Iran has often been very counterproductive. And that's something which has completely changed in Iran today, because people are far more open to what was produced back then.
I respectfully have to disagree with that, because it that's not how culture works. It's not on a one-on-one basis. It's not like one film is thrashed in journals or film magazines by one or two or many critics, and therefore that kind of stops the direction of filmmaking. We're talking about a whole. We're talking about a society that's engaging in conversations about filmmaking, about national identity, about cosmopolitan or transnational connections during this time. Of course, Hushan Qabusi was writing really harsh reviews about many of the films at the time, including Qaisa. He hated it. And then he makes a film that's, of course, also being really looked down upon by many critics of the time, and really not seen as one that was worthy. But what this does, in fact, it allows for flourishing of different trends, and that's something that we should take into account. It's not because people should be supporting a film in film criticism that we see branching of cinema, that we see different trends. It's exactly because of these critiques. That's what I'm saying. It's because of these critiques that people are making different films at this time, and they are really creating a very lively, dynamic culture, film culture, with many trends. We, of course, later on, we have also experimental films. I saw that someone was asking about animation. I can't speak to animation, but I know we do see animation during this time as well. So I just want to say, I think that the way the role of critics should be seen is also something that we, within the field of cinema, Iranian cinema, should also be revisited.
And I mean, this sort of critics' hostility is certainly not unique to Iran. I mean, Indian intellectuals were also always, I mean, really down to the present day, have been deeply conflicted about the commercial industry there and its products, which does at some level give birth to what they call the parallel or alternative cinema in the 1970s. It seems to be a sort of movement across the third world, we might say, in the 1960s and 1970s to create an alternative cinema to the one that people are actually watching. And in many cases, it's a state enterprise by and large. To do so, or at least the state begrudgingly gives some funding and support for it. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's always sort of very surprising to me is the role of the state in Iran when it comes to the film culture and film production. It has always seemingly played a kind of ambivalent role, whether under the Pahlavi era or under the Islamic Republican era. I think generally we can talk about a kind of attitude of benign neglect at best and malign neglect at worst. And I think you see that in the ancillary documents that we have, or the ancillary materials that we have for studying this cinema. I mean, how many times have I read articles in the industry magazines of the Pahlavi era that, filled with anxiety-ridden quotes by producers and directors about the lack of support from the state for improving the quality of cinema and improving the material conditions of cinema production in the country. And that those sort of themes continue in the Islamic Republican era as well, I think, in many ways. And so, yes, I mean, there's always been a kind of attitude of malign neglect, and I think that intensifies with the advent of television, where both under the Pahlavi regime and under the Islamic Republic, television becomes the most important medium as far as the state is concerned, because it's being beamed directly into people's homes, and thus it's seen to be even more dangerous than cinema might be.
So we have come actually to the end of the time that we were given to have a discussion about 123 years. We didn't get to all of that time period, of course, but maybe some of the questions or ideas we have about post-revolutionary, post-1979 Iranian cinema, we can kind of allude to those or respond to those also in the question and answer period. So I want to thank you all, and Negar, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rekab Talai, Mr. Khoshbakht, and Dr. Partovi. We do have a lot of good questions in our Q&A box. One question that was posed at the beginning of your discussion was about the loss in the cinema. How should we approach the loss? Do you think we should go beyond the lament and start to look with hope at the absent, lost, abandoned, or unfinished by looking at what has been once and no longer rather than wasn't at all? Would you please talk about the methodologies to reconstruct the loss through ephemera and even found footage, such as Farrokh Ghaffari's South of the City, original no longer exists, and Rivalry in the City as a found footage made by Ghaffari himself, but orphaned as he disowned. So if any of you can elaborate on this question, that would be great.
But some of them are lost, gone forever. This is as much as we know now, but and it's the chances for discovering something, like, let's say Iranian films produced at Imperial Film Company, okay, in India. We have Lurger is one of them, but there's more. And when I was there, I realized that probably the chances are next to nothing for finding something, because if even when there are films there now, they are in such poor condition that there's no way to restore them. But we can still do a lot. And it's surprising how much we can do, because not necessarily the early period, the entire history of Iranian cinema. We have some key titles from Iranian post-revolutionary cinema that are lost now. and it's unbelievable. Films done in the late 80s of which no copy exists. So it's a very sad situation for Iranian cinema. But I think what we can do is just to support the notion of preservation and restoration of Iranian films. Here we have the kind of a political barrier, because the majority of what we know as good or dependable material is held at the Iranian National Film Archive, and there is the ideological restriction for accessing those films. For instance, when I was doing the program on Samuel Khachikian, a tribute to Samuel Khachikian in Bologna in 2017, accessing those films, like two years of negotiation. They are not comfortable showing those films. They are probably okay restoring them, but they are not comfortable sharing these films with, definitely not the Iranian audiences, and perhaps not the international audiences. So it's just the matter of keep on searching, especially if we want to look for early images of Iran. And every year we discover new things. One of the films in the mobile program was a film from 1938 shot in Iran by Géo Colbert, a French cinematographer. Astonishing film, and we were not aware of its existence until now. So there is a lot to discover, but just creating understanding of, if we want to create something solid as the history of Iranian cinema, the first step is preservation.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that it truly is in many ways a kind of regional problem, as some pointed out. India, I don't think there are any films that we know of that exist from before 1950, or very few films that exist from 1950. There was a terrible fire in the National Film Archives there, I think about 15 years ago, that destroyed most of the film stock that they had from the first half of the 20th century, essentially. And yes, I mean, the Iranians have gotten a sort of late start in many ways in archiving their film history, and not a lot of resources have been put behind this particular effort. And in many ways, I mean, YouTube is a kind of a lifesaver. It's one of the few, perhaps the most important public depository that we have of early Iranian cinema now, including a copy of Dokhtar Lor.
And just to add to what was said, I think loss, of course, is always a loss. However, we can kind of put together the pieces of information or documents that we have from different, I guess, cultural productions of the time, to kind of provide a more comprehensive image of the era. Yes, the films are gone, but there may be writing about it. There may be a newspaper article about it, which again kind of sheds light on what was happening in the film, how the audience kind of reacted to it, and so on. So for me, again, it goes beyond just the celluloid, the image, and the film itself. It's more about the also surrounding culture.
Great. The next question. One question that the audience asks, one question that in my opinion needs clarification, is to discuss the subject from the point of view of the content about Iran, production by Iranians, or film culture among the public in Iran. These are significant angles of this discussion that would help understanding the topic in a better way. So maybe that's not a question, but is there anything that you would like to elaborate on regarding this point?
I think we kind of responded to that earlier, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, is there anything, Ehsan, you wanted to add?
No.
Great. Next question is, cinema has become a new form of artistic expression since the early 20th century in Iran. How has Iranian cinema been able to mature and perfect itself to catch up with other Persian arts, such as architecture, painting, music, carpet, etc.?
Iranian cinema has been great since the early 50s. Okay, this is not a 21st century phenomenon. Those films have been beautiful, wonderful, complex for a long time. Okay, I just want to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask a similar kind of question. I mean, who makes these judgments about its maturity? And it sort of speaks to the status of third world cinema generally, that, you know, it's Westerners, especially those associated with the film festival and art cinema circuit, that come to this conclusion or make this determination about the maturity of a particular national cinema. And I think in recent years, we've sort of heard this this term being used increasingly to speak of Iranian cinema, perhaps because it's no longer so one-dimensional on the film festival circuit like it once upon a time was. And so now we're getting increasingly films that are shown in Iran and have been received well by audiences in Iran, that are also being shown on the film festival circuit. I mean, the Farhadi films being a good example of this. Somebody that's managed to sort of straddle the line between, you know, commercial success and critical success. And, you know, I can't tell you how many reviews I've read that talk about Farhadi's cinema as, you know, a sign of the maturity of Iranian cinema. But so much of what is in Farhadi's cinema has been there since, as Ehsan points out, since the early 1960s.
And I echo both Pedram and Ehsan.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Next question, a little relevant. Please speak to the reception of actors and actresses by Iranian society. Would it be correct to state that as a profession, acting was looked upon disapprovingly? If so, why? Since it was and is a revered art form.
I'll start. So yeah, I mean, in the early years of filmmaking in Iran, and I should also say theater, not only filmmaking, but acting in general in both theater and in cinema, especially for female actresses. It was kind of looked upon disapprovingly, and even all the way to 1930s, later on into 1950s, we see that the way that women actresses are looked at by critics, by cinema audiences, it was not necessarily in the most positive way. And a lot of, in fact, actresses, a lot of female people who were involved in this industry, but particularly actresses, they suffered from that, of course. They were kind of marginalized in society, some of them. They were forgotten, especially as they got older. However, what I'm saying is actually not necessarily, you know, we need to keep into account that there are different trends, of course, happening. In 1940s, of course, Iranian theater is booming, with Nushin's theater, for example, and a lot of actresses, a lot of women who are playing in theater in 1940s later on entered the cinema screen or the cinema industry in 1950s, and it's then because of the experience that they have in theater, and also because they are seen as committed artists, they kind of change this aura around being a female actor or an actress.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that, yes, historically, acting in Iran has been seen as a kind of disreputable profession, even predating cinema. That was the case. That those who took part, for example, in the improvisational or comic theater were looked down upon for their participation in those art forms, and of course, you know, it sort of explains why many minorities, in particular Iranian minorities, went into acting, especially Armenian Christians and Jews. And of course, they also are among the first that sort of make the transition to film acting as well. And we get a sort of similar situation in India too, where we have Anglo-Iranians in particular playing a very important role in early cinema there before it becomes more widely accepted. But that level of acceptance is always limited. I mean, even in the United States, that's the case, I think. I mean, most middle-class families would probably not want their daughters, for example, to become Hollywood stars. Or dream of becoming Hollywood stars. So there's always been this sort of sense of this deep conflict, we might say, that people have had about acting altogether as a disreputable profession and something that respectable families don't want their children to enter.
There's also another form of disrepute, more subtle and equally problematic, and that's the line that was drawn between Iranian popular cinema and Iranian art house cinema, and the lack of acceptance of a so-called art house director wanting to work with a talent from Iranian popular cinema. And most of the time, they were really wonderful actors and actresses, but it was not accepted. Perhaps one extreme example is Fruzan, a very talented star of the 60s and 70s who appeared in a film by Dariush Mehdi, Daire Mina, and that was extremely controversial during its time. But now we look at the film, and the film is brilliant, and she's really wonderful in a different kind of role that she's playing in the film. That was also an ongoing problem of Iranian cinema, why people were asking Gulistan why Pavri Sayyad, a popular comedian, is acting in The Secret Treasures of Jinn Valley. These questions might seem very irrelevant now, but this was part of the ongoing discourse, which shows how clear the line in Iranian culture, not just Iranian cinema, was for a good number of people.
And to just add to that, I mean, a lot of women actually left this profession just because of the criticisms that they were receiving by cultural thinkers of the time.
Thank you. The next question, what are some of the top films of the Film Farsi era?
Tufan در شهر ما, The Storm in Our City, it's perfection. It's just so beautiful. It's a sci-fi, it's a musical, it's a comedy, it's a melodrama, it's everything in one film in 90 minutes. It's done with a kind of, it's directed with so much ease, you feel that it moves from one genre to another without you even noticing it. It's a film which caused physical reaction on the part of the audience when they screened the film in Italy in 2017. At the end of the film, the characters wave of the camera, and I looked around and people were waving back at the screen. It's a film which is like a call and response dialogue with the audience. It's that lively. That's a film which is very close to my heart, and I think it's a good example of Iranian popular cinema at its best. The majority of Samuel Khachikian films in the late 50s and early 60s enjoy the same quality. A film that was recently restored and screened in New York, Raqqase Shah, Dancer of the City, by very talented Shapur Ghari, is another example of a perfectly done Iranian melodrama with a strong female character, which is not that common in melodramas of the 70s, but you have that with Fruzan and Nasser Malekmuti, a film which has claims to being modern and being an example of cinema mutafawwid too. There are good reasons for looking at the film that way, but as a piece of popular cinema, it's just wonderful. I'm looking forward to see what Pedram and Gobag would recommend as examples of good examples of popular cinema.
Should I go first, or do you want to go?
Go ahead. Yeah, sure.
I mean, we could talk about this for hours, I suppose, but one that sort of always sticks in my mind is Can Do. Beehive is a film that just the torture that the lead character goes throughout the film has always sort of been burned into my memory and is hard to let go of. That's a film that I go back to at least once every 6 months or so.
And I think, I mean, it again really depends on how you define film Farsi. Do you define film Farsi only as popular cinema that has already also incorporated elements of alternative cinema? So it's really like a changing concept, I think, film Farsi from 1950s all the way to 1970s. Each decade perhaps has its own characteristics. Maybe some of the films that come to my mind and which I like, and I kind of feel like the audience at the time who really loved, based on the sources that I've read, Shab Nashini Dar Jahannam, Soiree in Hell, was really popular because you also have like Del Cash. Singing was really popular in that era. My own favorite, maybe from 1960s, I would say, Qaisar. Qaisar is just one of my favorites, all-time favorites. But that's, I think one of everyone's favorites. But that film is just so masterful in a lot of ways, and also speaks to so much of the anxieties of society at the time. And it has all elements of elements that really make a film both thrilling and entertaining, but also thoughtful, one that that really pushes you to think. And I would also like to add maybe one from 1970s, Juja Fokoli, which is in fact like a subversive version of Qaisar. I love that film. It's a really, really funny film. It really subverts everything that Qaisar kind of set in 1960s. Juja Fokoli tries to like kind of it continues that direction, but it's for a different era. It's as if like we're past that 1960s, 1968, and now we're in this new era. And Juja Fokoli seems to kind of be the epitome of the conversations in that era.
Great, thank you for all the suggestions. I've put all of them in the chat. Hopefully it's the right link for people's reference. We have one more question, and after this question, I'm going to go to some questions that are directed to each panelist. What do you think is the influence, positive or negative, of the International Film Festival circuit on Iranian cinema?
I mean, again, it's a very vast subject. There's a huge difference between pre-revolutionary. No, we shouldn't say pre-revolutionary. We should say pre-revolutionary period, when filmmakers were sending film directly, and then pre-revolutionary when the Ministry of Culture took over, post-revolutionary when the Islamic Republic was in charge only, and then the digital revolution when filmmakers could submit the films directly. So we have roughly 4 periods. The period that I'm interested in, pre-revolutionary period, has been really significant for various reasons. First of all, it's contributed to a kind of cultural dialogue between Iranian cinema and international world cinema and the modernist movements in other parts of the world. If you go and study the history of a film festival in Italy called Pesaro, you will see how much dialogue was going on between figures as significant as Pier Paolo Pasolini, Bernardo Bertolucci, with people like Ebrahim Gulistan and Farrokh Saad. It also had a positive impact on the preservation of Iranian cinema, because some of those prints were never returned to the country, thank God. And so we have a print in Switzerland, we have a print in Venice, we have a print of this film in Paris. So if there's just one good thing in the pre-revolutionary period about the international presence of Iranian cinema, is the fact that some of the prints were never returned, and today we can access those copies and perhaps work on them or screen them to the public.
I mean, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but one problem of the film festival circuit for Iranian cinema, and I wouldn't necessarily limit it to Iranian cinema, is that it constrains many filmmakers as well in terms of making films in a particular making formulaic films that will appeal to that film festival circuit audience primarily, rather than to audiences in Iran. And I think this has always been the problem of the film festival circuit for third world cinema altogether, is that the filmmakers at some level, always in the back of their minds, they're thinking about, well, what kind of film do these critics and cineasts and cinephiles in the West and elsewhere want to see from us, rather than what kind of films we want to make for ourselves or for our home audience. And I think that's always been a kind of problem. And a kind of related problem has been the misinterpretation by film festival audiences and critics of third world cinema altogether. I mean, perhaps the most famous example of this is the misinterpretation of Satyajit Ray's early films as being about the child character in that film Apu, in what comes to be known as the Apu trilogy, and it sort of helps to shape Satyajit Ray's career going forward as well, with this interpretation of his cinema as somehow upholding or uplifting the Indian child as the hope for India's future. The adults we can write off altogether, but the children at the very least give us hope that they can bring India into the modern age and make it look more like us here in the West. I think that's always been something that's a shadow that's always lingered over his cinema. And similarly, I think some Iranian filmmakers who have focused on the film festival circuit in their filmmaking have been affected in similar ways.
Thank you for all your great commentary. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask probably one or two more questions. So one question for you, Mr. Khoshbakht, is in one of your interviews, you have compared Fardin with the Italian Vittorio Gassman. What do they have in common, if you can have that summarized?
I talk rubbish all the time and I hardly remember. But if I have said that, I don't remember. If I said that, well, perhaps more of Sordi, because Alberto Sordi, because they could both sing and dance. But in terms of someone who was loved by millions, but could be equally flexible in a film with more nuances, playing a dramatic role, changing position easily from a musical to a drama. That's both were very good looking. So I guess I was referring to those qualities. You know, these things are often nonsense. You just want to give the Western audience a sense of who Fardin was. Of course, there's a huge difference between Fardin and Sordi or Vittorio Gassman, but to make them understand who Fardin was. So I'm talking about Iranian Vittorio Gassman. You want to simplify things, and sometimes it's dangerous to simplify things.
But I mean, I would add that there is something to that, that there was a recognition, at least by some Italian film producers, that Fardin could be accepted as a film star in Italy. And does he not make an Italian spaghetti western? Does he not star in an Italian spaghetti?
And even one of his films, there's a poster of Arrivederci, Tehran, the Khachukyan film was distributed in Italy. So yeah, it makes total sense. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. I have to mention that in our audience, we have Helen Ohanian, the daughter of Ovanes Ohanian, the founder of the cinema in Iran, as mentioned. So we have her email, and everyone and our panelists, if you need to contact her, I can copy her email also in our chat. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. I'm sure we had so many other great questions that unfortunately due to time restrictions we couldn't ask, but I want to thank our panelists, Dr. Rekab Talai, Mr. Khoshbakht, and Dr. Partovi. thank you so much. And on behalf of Professor Mustafi and the Persian Studies program, I wanted to thank everyone who joined us today and for all the great questions. For everyone's information, this great discussion was recorded, and some people have asked where we put the recorded events on our website. So I'm going to share the link for everyone in the chat so you can access this recording later on this link. If you don't have anything else to add, I would like to thank you everyone again and happy holidays. Is there anything you want to add?
Just thank you and happy
Thank
holidays.
you very much for having us.
Thank you so much. Happy holidays. روز خوبی داشته باشین و خدا نگهدار.
Happy holidays, everyone. Bye.